One of the biggest areas of criticism for the DCU so far is its overall slate and its lack of focus on some of DC's star characters. Even though there is certainly a time and place to take risks on more obscure characters that could potentially develop into really successful projects or franchises down the road, it is kinda wild that in the DCU, we will be getting projects for Creature Commandos, Clayface, Peacemaker, and a damn Jimmy Olsen series well before we get solo projects for the likes of Wonder Woman, The Flash, and Batman. Don't get me wrong, I am probably one of the most excited people on the planet for Clayface this upcoming October, and I'm not trying to say the DCU should only focus on characters that have featured prominently in the Justice League, but there needs to be far better balance going forward, and that is why I want to pitch how I think the slate for the DCU should go over the next few years through the year 2031. Because if Gunn and Safran just mostly follow the first slate of projects they announced back in January of 2023 with some small tweaks like a Jimmy Olsen series and a movie about Bane and Deathstroke, I have a bad feeling about the future of the DCU. Now before I start building out what I think the DCU should do, we need to establish what we know is currently on the horizon for the DCU. So if you're here just for the speculation of 2028 and beyond, where we don't have a clear idea of where the DCU may go, I'll make sure there's a timestamp in the description so you can just jump to that point. But to start, we need to talk about what we know, and let's start by talking about the rest of 2026. Where I do believe we already know what's going to be coming out, unless something like Mr. Miracle or Creature Commandos Season 2 randomly gets a release date later this year, which I suppose is possible, but I do find very unlikely. Those both seem to be projects for 2027, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in depth in a bit. But when it comes to the rest of the 2026 slate, I do give it a big thumbs up. You have Lanterns, which of course is focused on one of DC's biggest properties in the Green Lantern Corps. It's got a phenomenal creative team and is being released on HBO on Sunday night. Yes, we can bicker about some of the details of the plot, whether or not some of the story decisions are wise, and if Lanterns should have just been a movie, but this is a big time TV show about one of your most popular properties. I think it's a completely justifiable decision strategy wise and could be a huge success if the quality of the show is good. When it comes to Clayface, I also think strategy-wise, it's a completely justifiable decision. Now, I also understand how some joke about the idea that Clayface is getting a movie before the likes of Batman and Wonder Woman, and on just a surface level, that is ridiculous to say out loud, but with a lower budget of somewhere between $40 and $60 million, I do think this is something that the DCU can make a profit on in theaters if the quality is good, especially due to it being a horror movie coming out around Halloween. If you're gonna make a project on a more obscure character, you need to keep that budget in check, and based on everything we know right now, DC Studios is doing that with Clayface. A project like Clayface is exactly the type of more unique artistic swing I was always hoping we would see more from both Marvel and DC, so I'm definitely hoping it's a success, and I do think it has a real possibility of being one. Now moving into 2027, barring some major development towards the end of 2026, it does seem like we will only be getting one movie for the year when it comes to the DCU, but it'll be a 2-movie year for DC Studios as a whole, those 2 movies being Man of Tomorrow and The Batman 2, and with both of those movies, I absolutely have no notes. Ideally, both of those movies should be aiming to make over $800 million worldwide, if not $1 billion, especially for The Batman 2. And it truly doesn't get bigger than both Superman and Batman. My only real complaint for Gunn and Safran in 2027 is the fact that we will only be getting one DCU movie, which I do think is a bit concerning considering it'll be 4 years since the initial slate announcement, and you're telling me we couldn't get a second DCU movie on the board? For example, imagine if we would have gotten a Wonder Woman movie in 2027. Could you imagine getting solo movies for the entire Trinity in 1 year? That sounds pretty awesome to me. However, I'm also not advocating to rush movies into production either, so I understand that it just didn't come together, but I do believe going forward, the DCU needs to be getting out at least 2 movies a year, and that's what Peter Safran said the original strategy was. Thankfully though, in 2027, The Batman 2 makes up for it, as it's going to be a humongous movie with a lot of anticipation, and who knows, maybe it's gonna be a DCU movie. I'm kidding of course, and I don't want to start that whole conversation in this video. On the TV front, I do think this is when we are going to be getting the 2 animated series Creature Commandos and Mr. Miracle, which I'm hoping are good, but I sadly doubt will move the needle at all. Creature Commandos Season 1 was solid, but outside of die-hard fans for specifically DC, I'm pretty sure no one watched this series. Maybe it has picked up a larger fan base in the time since its release, but even though I am personally excited to see where Creature Commandos Season 2 goes, and I think there's potential for some damn good television, I doubt it'll be a project that garners a whole lot of discussion and fan interest, even if it is phenomenal. Mr. Miracle, I do think maybe has a chance to pop a little bit more and generate a bit more buzz, not really because Mr. Miracle is some A-list character, but I do think he, Barda, and the New Gods definitely have more name recognition than the Creature Commandos, and of course, the show is going to feature Darkseid, which will absolutely draw some eyeballs. Hopefully people actually tune into the show instead of just watching the clips with Darkseid, but at least the inclusion of Darkseid should put it on some people's radars, and hopefully its quality is so good it gets more eyeballs than expected. For the live action series, it seems like it'll just be the Jimmy Olsen and Gorilla Grodd show, which is something that I no doubt am interested in, as I really did like Jimmy Olsen and Superman, Superman, and Grodd is an awesome villain, but this is one of the projects where I totally understand why people give shit to Gunn and Safran, because what do you mean this is the next live action series you'll be making after Lanterns? Now, I'm not going to sit here and tear it down too much or jump to many major conclusions because we don't know a whole lot of details in regards to the show, and maybe we will get some details in the future that say it's being done on a super low budget, and maybe it'll become a surprise hit like Peacemaker Season 1. We actually have to see how this show turns out, but this is the definition of a project that I think is much wiser to make once the DCU has shown to be a success and has started to truly get some momentum. Maybe Man of Tomorrow will be that spark, but I have a hard time believing that this Jimmy Olsen and Grodd series will end up being some sort of huge success unless the quality is like a 9 out of 10 or better, which is always the possibility. I have no idea how the show is going to turn out, and just because I think concept-wise it's an odd decision doesn't mean that maybe it's not a home run idea that's just going to be absolutely phenomenal, but needing it for it to be like a 9 out of 10 or better in order to get a big audience does seem like a huge risk to me and doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I do think those 5 projects will be it for DC in 2027, and in summary, I give the movies a big thumbs up. The animated shows I think are a bit lacking in terms of huge upside commercially, but I love the idea of a Mr. Miracle show, and Creature Commando Season 1 was at least solid, and with it being animated TV, I think that's a format in which risks are great, so I can't be too mad about it. But with a live action series, I just can't find a way to sell myself on the Jimmy Olsen and Gorilla Grodd series making sense strategically, unless the show is just fucking phenomenal. I hope it is, and as a DC fan, I will be there day one, and genuinely speaking, I am curious to see what the show is, but I understand why so many people are giving shit to Gunn and Safran about making this show in the first place. 2028 is where the fun begins in my opinion, because outside of 2, maybe 3 projects, I do think at this point the release schedule becomes a bit more of a blank slate. Now, from the point going forward, I'm going to be adopting what Peter Safran said was the original production goal for DC Studios, and that's 2 live action movies, 1 animated movie, 2 live action series, and 2 animated series in 1 year. Now, I'm going to attempt to keep most of the projects DCU related outside of the animated movies, which seem to be outside of the DCU up to this point. That absolutely could change, but I'm just going off of what DC Studios has shown so far. Speaking of animated movies, we should start 2028 by talking about the one project with a release date, and that is Dynamic Duo by Swaybox Studios, which I'm absolutely fascinated to see. An animated movie about a young Dick Grayson and Jason Todd that are set on different paths by those who mentor them. Sounds like a story with a lot of potential, and I'm always excited to see more Dick Grayson and Jason Todd, but what really intrigues me about this movie is the animation and how this film ultimately is going to look. Talks coming out of the International Film Festival suggest its style is going to be unlike anything we have seen before, and I'm not surprised, as when I originally heard about this movie, I went to Swaybox Studios' website to see some of their work, and it is certainly unique and different than what you would expect from a studio making a DC film. I know there is a risk in trusting a studio without any sort of real track record developing a big budget animated film. However, I do think it's a swing worth taking, as I do think Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, and a sprinkle of Batman has enough name recognition for fans to be interested on premise alone, and if the movie ends up being good, I think it could be a huge success. Now, when it comes to the other 2 live action movies for 2028, we kinda know what they're going to be, but we also kinda don't. Let me explain. Recently, producer Lars Winter said that Supergirl will play a large role in the next movie that's going to go into production after Man of Tomorrow. Now, your guess is as good as mine when it comes to what that specific movie might be, but now, this is where my plan for the DCU takes over, and if I were the one making the call, it would be Supergirl featuring prominently in a Wonder Woman movie. Now, I would much rather have just a solo Wonder Woman movie, as I think that would make the most sense, but with the premise that Supergirl needs to be featured heavily, I do think Wonder Woman makes a lot of sense because they have spent extensive time together in the comics, and even Wonder Woman has trained Supergirl in the past, and I think that could be a pretty fun dynamic to see in the DCU, and I think Wonder Woman would be a great mentor for Supergirl. Even though it's not currently confirmed, I do think it's very likely that Wonder Woman does make an appearance in Man of Tomorrow, and if that is the case, I think an immediate spin-off for Wonder Woman would make a lot of sense, and even if she's not in the movie, we are long overdue for Wonder Woman's return to the big screen, so I truly kind of think that 2028 is probably about the latest we should be waiting for Wonder Woman, considering her overall importance to DC. There is, of course, another member of the Trinity that needs to be established in the DCU, and even though I would really like that to be in 2028, I do think it'll most likely have to wait until 2029, and that is because the other live-action movie that seems to already be in development at DC Studios and might be entering production soon, and that is the Deathstroke and Bane movie. Now, I'm not going to try and pass any judgment on this movie until we get some more details about the story, director, cast, and budget, but this is another one where I kind of just sit and ask myself, really? Don't get me wrong, Bane and Deathstroke are both awesome characters, and if you are just asking the DC fan in me, I'm pretty damn excited by the idea, and I really do think this could end up being a success if they're smart with things like budget and they get a really good director, because I do think Deathstroke and Bane are big enough characters that audiences audiences would be interested. Obviously, the movie would have to be great, but I do think as a duo, you can make a really kick-ass action movie that, if done at the right budget, could absolutely make enough money. However, it still is quite an odd choice. And I think it's completely reasonable to be skeptical about whether or not this is the right type of project for the DCU to be focusing on, and if I was personally running DC Studios, I probably would be focusing on other characters first. But okay, from this point on, it is truly my call for what we are going to be getting, as even though there are some projects that DC Studios seems to be actively developing, there is nothing that seems to be on the verge of being greenlit. Funny enough though, to start with the TV in 2028, I'm gonna approve the production of a show originally announced back in January of 2023, and that is the Booster Gold series, which I do think is perfect for TV and has the potential to be a fan favorite. I know Booster Gold is not some widely recognizable character for the general audience, but he is a fan favorite from the comics that I do think would give the show an immediate fan base when the show first comes out. If the show ends up being good, I truly think Booster Gold could end up being a fan favorite character in the DCU, and we could see viewership episode by episode increase a lot as season 1 progresses, similar to something like Peacemaker season 1. Also, when compared to Peacemaker, considering a Booster Gold series would definitely be more quote-unquote family friendly, I do think Booster Gold can be an even larger success than something like Peacemaker season 1 was, which was a huge success at the time. The other live action series I would love to make in 2028 is a Justice Gang series, or maybe the Terrifics depending on how Man of Tomorrow ends up, but just for the sake of this video, we're going to talk about it like it would be a Justice Gang series. In my opinion, the Justice Gang will never get the time it deserves simply showing up in Superman movies or just being sprinkled into something like Peacemaker. They deserve their own project, and I think after Man of Tomorrow, they certainly should be popular enough to get one. The series could serve as an opportunity to better establish the Justice Gang's place in the DC universe, as well as their relationship to Maxwell Lord, and also perhaps give origins to each individual member. Think of something similar to Creature Commando season 1, where there was the main story throughout the season, but each episode allowed for an individual character origin. I would love to see something like that for the Justice Gang. You could argue that maybe this should be a movie, and I understand that, but with the hopes of getting more fleshed out origins, I do think TV would probably be a better format, as they'd simply just get more time to tell these origin stories. Also, I know this may seem silly to some, but I do think if you're going to do a DC movie with the word justice in it, you do have to do the Justice League before you do something like the Justice Gang. I know that sounds stupid, but it would just be weird to get a Justice Gang movie before we got something like Justice League. On the animated front, I hope in 2028 is when we finally get the Blue Beetle series. Now, I truly cannot think of the last time we heard anything about this show, so it certainly could be in development hell, but I do love the version of Blue Beetle that we got in the 2023 movie, and I'm excited by the idea of him being brought into the DCU. I do think that a Blue Beetle series would quite easily be the highest profile animated series the DCU has produced up to this point. It would have a great chance of being a big success if it was good in terms of quality. The other animated series I personally would love to see is an Aquaman series. Now, even though I do think Aquaman should certainly get a movie at some point in the DCU, when 2028 rolls around, we will still only be 5 years removed from the last Aquaman movie on the big screen. Yes, that is a half decade, but I do think it would be wise to wait a little longer before introducing him again on the big screen, because a lot of people still associate Jason Momoa with that character. Plus, animation I think is the perfect format for a character like Aquaman, as I just think visually it's a bit more compatible. Plus, with the added time you would get from a TV series, you'd have a better chance of establishing the supporting characters around Aquaman, which I do think was lacking in the previous movies, as well as you could just flesh out a lot more of the history and the context behind Atlantis, which I think would give fans a deeper understanding and just be a bit more connected to Atlantis, which again, something that I just think they simply did not have enough time to do in the previous Aquaman movies, or just didn't spend enough time talking about it in general. I totally understand if some of you think differently and think that Aquaman should almost be an exclusive movie character, considering he is one of the bigger budget DC characters. However, I think this would be a really fun way to establish Aquaman in the DCU, and I think establishing Aquaman in the DCU before something like Justice League would be very beneficial. Moving into 2029, the big project for the year is going to be The Brave and the Bold. Depending on when the movie were to come out on the release calendar, it could potentially be 4 years after Superman before we get the first look at Batman in the DCU, which is simply way too long, but I do understand the odd circumstances in regard to Matt Reeves' Batman and wanting to give them plenty of space, but I do think roughly 18 months or more after the release of the Batman 2 is plenty of time, and I do think 2029 is the absolute latest this movie should be coming out. Now, I don't want to go too into the weeds with this conversation in this video, because we're going to have plenty of time to talk about The Brave and the Bold over the next couple of years, but this Batman movie has to not only be good, but it has to be really damn good, or else the DCU risks having the lesser version of Batman when compared to Reeves and Pattinson. And if you're James Gunn and Peter Safran, you simply cannot allow that to happen. If you have the knockoff version of Batman that nobody wants to see, and you just have everybody clamoring for Robert Robert Pattinson and Matt Reeves to return, you are going to be in a whole hell of a lot of trouble. However, conversely, if The Brave and the Bold is a smashing success, that could be the spark that really kicks the DCU into overdrive. I do not envy the pressure that this movie will be under, but hopefully DC Studios delivers something truly special. The other live action movie I would make in 2029 is a Green Arrow movie with a budget below $100 million. Now I know to some $100 million may seem really cheap, especially considering what other movies are being made for, but for a character like Green Arrow, which lacks any crazy powers that would require an insane CGI budget, I think it is absolutely doable, and there have been plenty of amazing action movies that have come in at $100 million or much lower over the last couple of years. A Green Arrow movie not only do I think has the potential to be a humongous success, but I think Green Arrow as a character has the potential to develop into an immensely successful franchise for the DCU, because even though he might not be on the same level as characters like Wonder Woman or Superman in terms of name recognition, he is an absolute fan favorite from the comics, and I do think he has a bit more name recognition than you would think, thanks to the Arrow series, which definitely made him a bit more of a household name. I do think at $100 million, yes, it would still have to make some good money to turn a profit, but I think if it's good in terms of quality, it would absolutely be a huge smashing success for the DCU. Moving on to the live action series in 2029, I do think this is where we're going to be getting a Lantern Season 2. Now this is of course operating on the idea that Lanterns is a success, which I know will probably be a step too far for some of you, but I'm the one calling the shots here, and in my fantasy world, Lantern Season 1 was a success, and Chris Mundy is granted his wish of developing a second season of Lanterns. Now personally for Lantern Season 2, I would love if the series focused on establishing new Lanterns, whether or not that's the likes of Jessica Cruz or Kyle Rayner, just someone else besides John or Hal, because after Season 1, I do think they should graduate to being mostly utilized in movies. Of course, I would love to see them appear in Lantern Season 2, but new characters should be the focus, as I think establishing other Lantern characters would be very smart in the long run, as the Lanterns could be a whole franchise completely on their own within the DCU, considering all of the mythology and lore that they have. The other live action series I would love to see is Paradise Lost. Now I know some believe that this is an idea that has no chance of success, and you may be right. I'm not going to act like I know everything, but this is something that I absolutely think is right up HBO's alley and I think has potential. The reason why I think it has a chance to succeed and bring in a lot of viewers is because it could provide some great insight into Themyscira, its history, who lives there, and simply provide more context to Wonder Woman. And based on my plan of having a Wonder Woman movie out in 2028, if that is a success, I do think fans would be quite interested in learning more about her home. When it comes to the animated front, this is where I do struggle the most, as it feels like DC could go in any direction, but for my one animated movie in 2029, I'm gonna go with Teen Titans. Now I know to some that may be a bit disappointing, as Teen Titans feels like a brand that too often is forced to be put in animation, and to be clear, I'm not against a live action movie for the Titans, and if this were a decade-long projection for the DCU, I would definitely have a live action Teen Titans movie on there, but when thinking about animated movies and what DC can do, I think Teen Titans is a brand that absolutely works because it's family friendly, it's a brand that already a lot of people already associate with animation, plus I think in the larger context of the DCU and its story, I think that this Teen Titans animated film could be a great prequel about the first Teen Titans team led by Dick Grayson, who by the time we see in live action most likely in the DCU is already going to be Nightwing. So my idea for the DCU Titans franchise, I suppose, is an animated movie that details the first team of Teen Titans that is led by Dick Grayson, and then after The Brave and the Bold, when we get Damian Wayne established, that's when we could do a Teen Titans live action movie where Damian leads the team. For the animated series, we could really go in any direction once again, but I do think there is one character that would be perfect for animation, and it's somebody that I believe Gunn has maybe teased in the past, and that is Animal Man. For those of you not familiar with Animal Man, I beg you to go read Grant Morrison's run on the character, because my god, it's just amazing, and basically what I want used as the inspiration for an Animal Man series, which I do think is the best medium for a story like that. The other animated series I'm approving for 2029 is a Constantine series. Some could argue that this would be better for a movie, but I think the budget required to do a true balls to the wall Constantine project would probably exceed what I would feel comfortable doing for a character that I'm not sure has wide appeal to the general audience. That's why I think starting out in animation makes a lot of sense, and I think over say an 8-episode season of television, you could do some truly awesome shit and build interest in the darker part of the DC universe, which could be further expanded upon in future DCU projects. Now moving into 2030, the first live action movie we are going to get is a Flash film. Now in the past I have jokingly said that James Gunn needs to write a blank check to Lord & Miller so that they can produce the Flash movie they almost made in the past, and have even as recently as this year said they still have interest in developing, but for the sake of this exercise, I'm not kidding. I'd be doing everything in my power to get them to work on a Flash film once they wrap up their work with Across the Spider-Verse Part 2. However, even if they weren't able to do it, I think by 2030 we need a Flash movie so that we can rehab the image of the Flash in the eyes of the general audience and establish him in the DCU before the big movie of 2030, and that is the first true Justice League movie in the DCU. By this time, you would have most of the central figures of the Justice League established with their own movies or shows, and I think bringing them all together for an epic Justice League movie would most likely be the DCU's first real attempt to crack $1 billion. I would love if something like Man of Tomorrow, Wonder Woman, or The Brave and the Bold accomplishes that feat much earlier, but I do kind of have to see it to believe it. I'm not entirely sure how James Gunn would build the DCU's version of the Justice League, and whether or not the Justice Gang would just be incorporated into the team, but based on my DCU roadmap, for the first Justice League movie, the team I am thinking would include Superman, Supergirl, Wonder Woman, Jon Stewart, Batman, The Flash, Aquaman, and hopefully Martian Manhunter, who I know I do not have a solo project for yet, but hopefully after Justice League he would be one of the first to get a show or movie if the Justice League movie succeeds. For the animated movie in 2030, I'm going to go with the rumored project that literally just got revealed as I am making this video, and that is a Super Family animated movie by Sway Box Studios, who is also developing Dynamic Duo. Now I want to be clear, this is still very much a rumored project, but has been reported on by a very reputable trade site in the rap, and even if it isn't real, this is definitely the type of animated movie I would love to see from DC Studios going forward. For my slate, I would have it outside of the DCU, and I assume if this project is real, it would be outside of the DCU. Now moving over to live action TV, I would love to see a series about The Question. Now there's no doubt that The Question is a much lesser known character, however, I do think a gritty detective series is something that could have wide appeal, especially if it's being released by HBO, where they specialize in that type of series. The Question is something that I also believe could be done for a very modest budget, giving the show an even greater chance to succeed. The other live action series in 2030 would be a Checkmate series that also serves basically as Peacemaker Season 3 and would be heavily influenced by the Salvation comic run. Now, it wouldn't be a true adaptation of that comic because I think the DCU is far from being able to do something like that, but it would be a story focused on getting Chris off of Salvation. I know there is some belief that this could be a big focus of the movies, and personally, I really hope not. Peacemaker and Rick Flag Sr. have no business being the center of something like a Justice League movie, or any movie for that matter. I do think rescuing Chris and further explaining something like life on Salvation is perfect though for a season of television. On the animated TV front, give me a Doom Patrol series which details the origin of the team, as well as a JSA series that gives more details to the past Age of Heroes that we get some teases for in Superman, and I absolutely think deserve a bit more exploration and would give a bit more context to the history of the DCU, which has had metahumans for several hundred years. Now finally, we are in 2031, where we will kick off with a Martian Manhunter movie that details his origin and his journey to Earth. I do think Martian Manhunter is a movie that maybe could be made before Justice League, especially if he does show up in Man of Tomorrow, but I think giving the DCU time to find its stride and hopefully hit a home run with something like Justice League would give a solo Martian Manhunter film a better chance to succeed, as I do think it most likely will require a pretty high budget. The other big live action movie for the year should be a Wonder Woman sequel. Now I know based on my roadmap it'll be quite some time between Superman movies, so I could argue perhaps that this should be a Superman movie, but I do think he will serve as the main character in Justice League, and even though he will not be getting his own quote-unquote solo movie for a few years, he will still be getting plenty of screen time. In 2031, it would be 3 years since the last Wonder Woman movie, and Wonder Woman is a character that the DCU should absolutely be aiming to make a trilogy around, and I think 3 years between movies makes a lot of sense. Now for 2031, I would also love to see something different, like a Swamp Thing movie or a Justice League Dark, or maybe even something more similar to Clayface that is a bit more genre focused and unique tonally from the rest of the DCU, but following the 2 live action movie goals set by Safran does make that a little difficult. Maybe if a Justice League movie comes out and is a huge success that say crosses $1 billion, the DCU may change its philosophy a little bit and aim for 3 live action movies each year, similar to what we saw from the MCU for so many years, which I do understand is risky because you need to make sure you're delivering 3 good movies, but if that were the case in 2031, I would definitely hope by that time we can maybe get something like a Swamp Thing movie, but if we're only going to be doing 2 movies a year, I definitely think we need Martian Manhunter, and we'd be long overdue for a Wonder Woman sequel. When it comes to the animated movie for 2031, I am absolutely making the Batman Beyond movie that was pitched by some of the people that worked on Into the Spider-Verse, as not only do I think it visually could be absolutely insane to see a futuristic Gotham in animation, but also I really do think that DC could have a huge franchise on their hands if that movie is good. Maybe not as successful, but kind of similar to what Into the Spider-Verse has meant for Sony. Moving to TV, the first animated series will be a Bat Family origin show that will detail some of the biggest moments of Bruce Wayne's early days as Batman. These could be things like the first time he put on the suit, his first encounter with somebody like the Joker or Scarecrow, and more specifically how Dick Grayson became Robin, how Barbara Gordon became Batgirl, and maybe how we lost Jason Todd if Jason Todd is in the DCU. Because The Brave and the Bold will be starting with a Batman most likely much more into his prime, considering he will already have Damian, I would love to get more of the backstory fleshed out in something like a show. The other animated series for 2031 will be a fun new take on the Suicide Squad. The Suicide Squad, of course, has worked on the past on the big screen, but I personally think they'd be great for animation. The first live action series will be a New God series. This would be a much more in-depth exploration of the New God's origins, the history of Apocalypse and New Genesis, and providing more detail about many of the central New God figures like Highfather, Darkseid, Orion, and more. At some point, I do think the DCU should build towards Darkseid as the big bad, and even though I think people would be excited enough by just him simply showing up for the first time in, say, a Justice League movie after the Mr. Miracle series, I think really giving depth to the New Gods, and more specifically Darkseid, could pay off huge in the long run. I understand this would be a high-risk project, as it most likely would require a pretty substantial budget, but I think HBO could absolutely deliver something great, and hopefully by 2031, the DCU has found its footing enough that it's able to take a big swing like this. The other live-action series would be a Lobo series that would be based on Keith Giffen and Alan Grant's Lobo: The Last Zarnian miniseries. Even though it is told in present time with a mission Lobo is tasked with carrying out, the story gives a lot of backstory for Lobo and I think is the perfect story for Lobo's first solo outing in the DCU. Well, that's my roadmap through 2031. I would love to hear what you would do if you were named CEO of DC Studios. Make sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.